We've seen so many brilliant fights in the last 30 years that the UFC has been operating, and it's obvious that not each and every fight can be as amazing as the fight between Robbie Lawler and Rory MacDonald. However, some fights are just plain old bad. They're so bad that not even UFC promoter Dana White can even justify their conclusions. Whether it's the judge's decision or a fighter's performance or even a strange circumstance that shouldn't have ever happened. These are a few fights that Dana White hated. So let's get into it with the first one, Anderson Silva versus Demian Maia. At UFC 112, we saw the UFC in Abu Dhabi for the first time, and the UFC made sure to deliver one stacked card for fans. We saw Hughes versus Gracie, Edgar versus Penn, and Silva versus Maia. So, after 3 finishes on the main card and a great back-and-forth brawl between BJ Penn and Frankie Edgar, the UFC almost had a flawless first event in a new market. However, what followed in the main event was extremely boring, and we mostly saw Silva toy with Maia for most of the fight.
Suicide bomb on one of those left. He's staying standing.
Anderson Silva was clearly the more dominant striker.
Anderson Silva, everybody's angry at him. And it was a very disappointing fight.
But he refused to engage or capitalize on the success that he had in the early rounds. We saw Silva win by unanimous decision.
Anderson, the Spider! Silva!
But Dana White dragged him after the fight. Dana apologized to the fans and questioned Silva's marketability after the fight.
And look at Anderson. When the fight was over, he couldn't even stand up to do his interview. He had to sit down to do his interview. And I made a big mistake. I shouldn't have let him fight this fight tonight.
Another fight that Dana White wasn't too big of a fan of is the fight between Curtis Blaydes and Alexander Volkov. Now, after this fight, Dana White had a few ill words to say about Curtis Blaydes. Blaydes took the victory after 5 rounds via unanimous decision, but it was far from the ragdoll prediction that Curtis had before the fight. At the time, Curtis was knocking on the door for a UFC heavyweight title shot, despite previous losses to Francis Ngannou. Dana quickly shot down the idea of a title fight and said that Blaydes looked stupid when he made financial demands, but then he underperformed significantly in his main event opportunity. The next fight was between Georges St-Pierre and Johnny Hendricks. Now, to say that White was angry after this fight is an understatement. He was absolutely furious, not only at the judges but also at St-Pierre, because he said that he would be stepping away from the sport. Dana wasn't a fan of these comments and gave St-Pierre an ultimatum. Either he would have to fulfill his duties as a champ or he would never be able to return to the sport.
28, 27, and still!
Dana White is one angry man when he needs to be, and he's not scared to give his opinion of fights. And the next fight was, well, he called it an abomination. Leading into UFC 226, all eyes were on Francis Ngannou and Derek Lewis, and we were expecting one great fight. We wanted the fight to score either the fight of the night or the knockout of the night performance bonus. However, things turned out quite differently. The fight didn't deliver, and instead, it was called one of the worst fights in UFC history. Now, as you can imagine, Dana White wasn't pleased with this fight, so he called the fight an abomination. Though both of the fighters are to blame, White was much more receptive to the winner of the fight. He sympathized with Derek Lewis, aka the Black Beast, and his back problem, but Francis Ngannou got most of the hate from Dana. He said that his ego was to blame for the lack of activity in the fight and his extremely poor performance. So to say that Dana White was critical of Ngannou's performance is an understatement. So you thought Demian Maia was only going to be on this list once, didn't you? But no. His fight against Tyron Woodley is also on Dana White's hate list. The UFC 214 fight was extremely boring. We saw Tyron Woodley defend his belt against Maia, and after 5 lackluster rounds, only 86 total punches were landed. They broke the record for the least activity in a main event fight. Woodley walked away with the win, but was heavily criticized by Dana White. White said that Woodley had plenty plenty of opportunities to engage in the fight as the superior and stronger fighter. At the post-fight press conference, Dana questioned what he would do with Woodley, especially given his lackluster performance and his marketability as a champ. To add insult to injury, Dana confirmed that he would move forward with St. Pierre's return to the UFC against Michael Bisping, instead of a return to welterweight against Tyron Woodley. The next fight that Dana White hated is widely criticized: the bout between Jon Jones and Matt Hamill. Jon Jones' record had no losses on it until this fight. You might think, Jones was knocked out and now everyone is unhappy. But no, his perfect record was broken after he was disqualified. Jones landed some 12-6 elbows, and referee Steve Mazzagatti stopped the fight. Hamill was declared unable to continue, and this led to the end of the fight. However, rather than declaring the fight a no contest, the fight was declared a disqualification and Hamill took the win. Dana White wasn't pleased at all with this decision and said that it shouldn't have happened that way.
Due to intentional elbows, there's been a disqualification of Johnny Bones Jones. Therefore, the winner is Matt Hamill.
In the years after the loss, Dana and the UFC brass would look into ways to overturn this decision. Sadly, they were unsuccessful. Given Jones's successful career and long reign as champion, and his marketability as an undefeated champion — by the way, this is a feat only Khabib has accomplished — this would have been a huge leverage point for the UFC. Sadly, Dana White, Jon Jones, and the UFC were deprived of this opportunity by Steve, and it's clear to see that this is highly infuriating for Dana White. The next fight was between Tito Ortiz and Forrest Griffin. The fight that would finalize their trilogy ended in a win via unanimous decision for Forrest Griffin. This fight was also the last in the UFC for both of these fighters. Forrest retired later, and Tito moved on to fight in other promotions. This fight was really underwhelming, and Dana White wasn't happy with how it went. He wasn't particularly impressed with either of the fighters' performances, and stated that they both looked slow. However, he did agree that it was time for both of them to step away from the UFC. On top of the criticism over the fight, Dana White was particularly furious with Griffin. He stormed out of the cage even before a decision was made. Griffin did return to the cage, only to take the mic from Joe Rogan to speak with Ortiz for his final UFC post-fight interview. This was a very strange set of circumstances, and the boss wasn't really fond of it. As a small bonus, before we go, Dennis Hallman's fight against Brian Ebersol was another fight that Dana White wasn't too fond of. Not because the fighters couldn't perform or because of a DQ, but instead Dennis's attire. His shorts were a bit too short, and this was way back when the UFC was still on its way to being recognized as a legitimate sport. So we get why White was a bit pissed off. Dana felt embarrassed, but luckily for him, Hallman was knocked out in the first round, making it a quick and easy payday for Brian. So, which one of these fights disappointed you the most? And should they overturn Jones's DQ decision? Let us know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you in another video.
Hey everybody, I'm here to save everybody, whatever. No, you're trying to become relevant again, is what you're trying to do.